Of all the places Victor Hargrove thought he'd find hope, a cracked, garbage-strewn sidewalk outside the country's most expensive hospital wasn't one of them. He wasn't used to anyone touching him, let alone the ragged fingers of a filthy child who smelled of sweat and old oil. Yet here stood a boy, barefoot, skinny as a broomstick, face streaked with grime, tugging gently on Victor's cuff as his bodyguards moved in. "Sir," the boy whispered, eyes steady despite the bruises around them, "I can make your daughter walk again." Victor froze. The words sliced through the fog of another hopeless diagnosis, another medical specialist shrugging their polished shoulders. Another reminder that all his billions could buy was care, not cures. Emily's legs hadn't moved in 3 years. Spinal trauma. Top doctors. Cutting-edge tech. Nothing worked. And now this. His first instinct was anger. Was this some kind of scam? A cruel joke by fate, to dangle false hope when he was already hanging by threads of sanity? But something about the boy's voice wasn't desperate or pathetic. It was confident, like he knew something nobody else did. Victor looked down. No shoes. Torn pants. Calloused hands, burned from scavenging scrap metal. "Get him away from me," Victor finally said, disgust curling his lip. But the boy stepped forward anyway, slipping past the guards before they could shove him back. "I'm not asking for money," he said softly, almost apologetically. "Just let me try." Victor didn't know what was worse, the arrogance or the pity. "I don't have time for children's fairy tales," he muttered. "Neither do I," the boy replied quietly. A long, tense moment passed between them. And in that moment Victor realized with quiet horror that he had already spent every resource, chased every lead, burned through hope like dry paper. What was left but humiliation? If humiliation brought results, then maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. "What's your name?" Victor finally asked, voice low. "Amir," the boy said. His accent was local, rough around the edges, not foreign or theatrical. Just a street kid who sounded like every other ignored child in the capital. Victor didn't like charity cases. He despised the token philanthropy most rich men indulged in. It wasn't that he was cruel, it was just that helping people rarely made anything better. The world was broken and no amount of donations could weld it back together. But this wasn't charity. This was desperation. "Fine," Victor snapped, his tone still sharp. "Say your piece." Amir hesitated. Then he unzipped the ragged backpack hanging off one shoulder. Out came something that looked like it belonged in a junkyard, bits of worn tubing, scavenged servomotors, bicycle gears, and what appeared to be homemade circuitry glued to thin metal strut. Victor squinted. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" "A muscle nerve response amplifier," Amir said flatly. "It's not perfect yet, but I've been testing it on children who have lost lower limb function from trauma injuries." Victor's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Testing? You're not even old enough to have a bank account." "I read," Amir said, holding his ground. "Physics, biology, robotics, whatever I could get from the library or old computers in junk heaps." "You're joking," Victor muttered. "You built this with trash?" "Trash to you," Amir said carefully, not insulted, just honest. "Useful to me." It was insane. Completely absurd. Victor's empire had stretched across industries, software, biotech, defense contracts. He'd spent millions funding startups working on neurological interfaces for exactly this kind of problem. And here was a barefoot child holding a tangled web of junk, speaking calmly about medical engineering. "You expect me to trust my daughter to that?" "I expect you to trust her with a chance," Amir said. Victor's jaw tightened. Behind him, Emily sat quietly in her wheelchair, her pale face unreadable, eyes distant as usual. Her hair was too neat, combed by nurses. She didn't flinch at the boy's invention. If anything, there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Curiosity. Victor's pride screamed to walk away, to shove the boy aside, to tell his guards to make sure Amir never came near him again. But something deeper, a cracked, exhausted voice inside him said, "What if?" Amir wasn't offering guarantees. He was offering the possibility that this wasn't the end. "I've read about you," Amir added suddenly, catching Victor off guard. "Your company built prosthetics for veterans overseas. The neural interfaces they used, they were based on my designs." "What?" "I published them online under a username," Amir said, expression flickering. "I don't care about credit. I care about fixing things." Victor's mind reeled. It couldn't be true. Could it? He remembered vague engineering papers anonymously posted on obscure forums, concepts that engineers at his subsidiary had quietly borrowed. This was madness. Absolute madness. And yet, here was madness offering a cure where sanity had failed. Victor didn't speak for a long time. The noises of the hospital faded into the background. The polished floors, the chrome railings, the sterile, over-expensive treatment facilities, it all felt distant. Right now, all that existed was a boy in rags holding a miracle built from scrap. The guards shifted awkwardly. One muttered, "Sir, do you want us to call the car?" Victor waved them off, eyes locked on Amir like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. "I don't believe you," he said finally. "But I'm tired of believing doctors who lie prettier than you." Amir didn't smile. He only nodded. "Then let me prove it." Victor's hand trembled slightly. Years of power, of success, of winning every business war, and here he was, beaten by the one thing wealth couldn't command: hope. Emily's gaze met his. For once, she wasn't empty. She looked alive. Against every instinct, every ounce of cultivated pride, Victor did the one thing he hadn't done in decades. He said yes. The next hour felt like stepping off a cliff into a storm with no bottom. Victor didn't even know why he let the boy follow them home. His estate, a mansion on the outskirts of the city surrounded by cold glass walls and sharp security systems, had never looked so absurd. Luxury without life. Riches that couldn't fix a broken spine or return movement to a little girl's leg. Amir didn't flinch when they arrived. He didn't stare wide-eyed at the marble floors or the imported art or the fleet of silent, polished staff waiting for orders. He only clutched that battered backpack tighter, like it was worth more than all the gold leaf in Victor's library. Victor's wife wasn't home. She hadn't been home much since Emily's accident. Grief had a way of making cowards out of the best people. Victor understood. He didn't blame her, not anymore. You could only cry for so long before you started breaking windows or screaming at furniture. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. Emily was wheeled to the main living room, not because she wanted to but because the nurse followed routine. She didn't say anything when Amir approached. Just watched him with those same unreadable eyes. It was like she didn't expect anything anymore, good or bad. Her world had shrunk to routines and polite lies from specialists. Amir knelt in front of her, slow and careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. No sudden movements, no speeches, just focus. He unpacked the contraption from his bag like it was made of glass, every wire coiled with purpose. Victor paced nearby, arms folded. He didn't like this. Didn't like trusting amateurs. Didn't like trusting hope. Amir adjusted the braces around Emily's legs, tightening soft straps with improvised cushions made from shredded shirt. Nothing sharp. Nothing that would cut. The motors attached near the knee joint, while the crude circuit boards ran along thin aluminum plates that fit the curve of her calf. Victor couldn't help but wince. It looked like junk. But then he noticed the precision of the angles. The way the servos aligned perfectly with the muscle groups they were meant to assist. This wasn't some haphazard pile of metal, it was designed with intent, by someone who'd studied the anatomy diagrams most engineers ignored. "It works by amplifying residual nerve signals," Amir said quietly. "Even with spinal trauma, some weak electrical impulses still travel down to the legs. Doctors usually ignore them because they're not strong enough to matter. But with these," he tapped one servo gently, "it doesn't matter how weak they are. The machine does the rest. Victor remembered the failed exosuit prototypes his companies had tested, millions of dollars poured into heavy, complex systems that required constant calibration and trained technicians to operate. None of them ever worked on kids. None of them ever looked this human. Will it hurt her? Victor asked. Amir shook his head. If I'm wrong, the servos will just stall. It's crude, but safe. Emily spoke then, softly, startling both of them. Let him try. Victor glanced down at her, heart twisting. Emily never volunteered for anything anymore. For her to speak up now meant more than anything a team of specialists could say. Amir nodded once and made the final connections. Emily, he said gently, don't try to stand. Just think about moving your foot, like you used to before. Just a little. Silence followed. Long, brittle silence. Victor watched her face, the slight tightening around her jaw. Concentration. Fear. Hope. Then, movement. It was tiny. Barely noticeable. But Victor's breath caught in his throat. The right foot shifted half an inch, the servo clicking faintly in response, translating that minuscule nerve command into actual, physical movement. A twitch, but it was hers. Emily's lips parted slightly. Not a smile yet, but the ghost of one. Her fingers clenched the sides of the wheelchair. Again. A second movement. The other foot this time. Fractional, hesitant, but undeniably hers. Victor's knees nearly buckled. It wasn't some wild miracle or divine act. It was brutal, hard science meeting stubborn will. Proof that all the polished doctors had missed something because they weren't desperate enough to search where no one cared to look. The guards who'd escorted them home stood at the far wall, staring like statues. Even they knew they were witnessing something that money couldn't explain. Victor crouched next to Emily, hands trembling, afraid to break the moment. He didn't dare cry, not here, not yet. How did you figure this out? He asked Amir, voice hoarse. Amir didn't puff up with pride or give a rehearsed speech. I studied everything I could find. Old Soviet prosthetic experiment. DIY robotics forums. Cheap materials, smart mechanic. I've been testing on injured street kids in the slums. No one cares about them. No one funds anything for them. But I care. Victor swallowed hard. He thought of the grants his companies had given to sleek, overfunded universities, chasing profit and patents, ignoring the broken kids sitting in alleys a few miles from his high-rise boardrooms. Amir kept adjusting the braces, small turns of screws, calibrating on instinct more than engineering equipment. Doctors don't trust street kids to know anything, he added. But sometimes you don't need polished degrees. You just need someone stubborn enough to fail 1,000 times and try again anyway. Victor sat back on his heels, heart pounding. Why help me? You don't even know us. Amir paused, looking up at him for the first time with something sharp beneath the quiet. I don't help people for their names. I help because no one helped me. Someone has to start. Victor stared at him, realizing that this ragged boy, wearing nothing but threadbare clothes and resolve, had just done more for his daughter than $1 billion had managed. And that's when the shame hit. Heavy. Crushing. For all his power, for all his pride, he'd let his own prejudice blind him. He'd walked past boys like Amir 100 times, thinking they were part of the problem, not realizing they might be holding the solutions no one else cared enough to find. Emily tried again. This time her foot lifted higher, trembling but undeniable. Tears pricked Victor's eyes. Not because of weakness, because of release. The dam had cracked, and Amir, still calm, still focused, was already adjusting wires, muttering calculations under his breath. Not for glory. Not for payment. Just to help. Victor suddenly realized that this boy wasn't just giving Emily a chance to walk again. He was giving him something rarer, a chance to be someone better. 2 days later, the media caught wind of the story. Not because Victor wanted it. Not because Amir wanted it. It was one of the nurses, wide-eyed at the sight of Emily's faint but deliberate steps, who whispered to a local journalist. Within 24 hours, Victor's estate was surrounded by cameras, drones hovering, eager voices begging for interviews, and headlines flashing "Billionaire's daughter walks again thanks to Street Boy's invention." Victor didn't want the attention. Not yet. It felt too raw, too sacred to parade around. Emily had only managed 3 careful steps, guided by Amir's steady adjustments, her body fighting through atrophy and muscle memory that had long since forgotten movement. But the world didn't care about nuance. It only wanted the miracle. For the first time, Victor saw something worse than indifference: exploitation wrapped in excitement. News anchors framed Amir like some sort of freak prodigy, using the same polite but poisoned language Victor recognized from years of corporate doublespeak. Unlikely genius, they said. Homeless savant. Not a person. A story to sell ads. Victor felt the disgust crawl through his stomach, realizing how quickly human triumph could be twisted into spectacle. Amir didn't flinch at the attention. If anything, he ignored it. He only spoke to Emily. Only listened to her body's feedback as she tried, over and over, to lift one foot, then the other. His entire world was her recovery. The flashing lights outside might as well have been thunderstorms on another planet. Victor stood by one of the massive glass windows overlooking the garden, watching the press like an army of scavengers. He knew their tricks, knew how quickly they'd turn this moment into a headline war. But he also knew another truth. The story was out, and there was no pulling it back now. It wasn't long before the experts arrived. Doctors from prestigious universities, engineers with degrees longer than their names, representatives from medical device companies, smelling patents and investment opportunities. They came with polite smiles and hidden knives. They came with folders of NDAs, with soft hands that had never built anything in the real world. And they came with something more dangerous than ignorance: ego. Victor watched them cluster around Amir, speaking in slow, patronizing tones like adults to a child. Words like "remarkable for someone in your position" and "we'll take it from here" filled the air, as if Amir had accidentally stumbled upon greatness and now needed professionals to properly package his discovery. But Amir's eyes were sharper than any of them realized. When one biotech executive offered him a grant to study under proper supervision, Amir simply said, "No." They didn't understand that word. They assumed he didn't comprehend what they were offering. Another doctor, older, white hair, polished accent, stepped forward with a gentle smile. "We can commercialize this, my boy. Make sure your work helps thousands, maybe millions. Let us take it to the next level." Amir looked at Emily's trembling knees. Not the doctor. Not for sale. Victor felt something bloom in his chest. Pride mixed with rage. These men hadn't lifted a finger to help when it mattered. Now they wanted to put their names on someone else's sweat. One engineer pulled Victor aside privately, voice low and confidential. "This prototype, it's impressive, sure. But it's primitive. We'll build better versions in labs. We've got the talent. This kid's an anomaly, but amateurs can't run medical programs. Let the grown-ups do the work." Victor didn't respond. He just stared at the man until the engineer realized he'd overstepped. For the first time in his career, Victor saw the sharp edge of his own complicity. These were his people. Polished, educated, credentialed, and blind to anything that didn't come from their closed ecosystems of privilege and funding. He knew their language because he'd spoken it too long himself. But Amir wasn't here to play their game. The boy wasn't interested in licensing deals, or television appearances, or fast money. He only cared about Emily standing again. And maybe, just maybe, something bigger than that. Something that terrified the neatly dressed opportunists. A world where solutions didn't always need to pass through their approval first. Victor could have stepped aside. Let the professionals drown Amir's work in paperwork, take it apart, patent the mechanisms, and turn it into something shiny with a corporate logo on the side. But something shifted in him that day. When the next group arrived, this time wearing matching suits, badges from a major orthopedic tech company, Victor stood between them and Amir. This technology, Victor said calmly, belongs to him. Not to me. Not to you. And I'm going to make sure it stays that way. One of them smiled, tight and false. We can fight that in court. Victor smiled back, colder. Try me. Money could buy a lot of things, but it couldn't buy the shame in Victor's bones, and that shame had now become a weapon. Emily took another step that afternoon, slow, guided by Amir's device. Each inch was war, but each inch was hers. Victor gathered his legal team that night, not to protect his wealth, but to protect Amir's invention. He didn't want another tragedy of stolen genius buried under corporate trademarks. Amir finally spoke to him alone that evening. I'm not stupid, he said. I know how these people work. They'll copy this, maybe even make it better. I'm not against that. Victor frowned. Then why not sell it? Get something back for yourself. Amir's voice was steady. Because I don't want them making it for people like you. I want it for kids like me. The ones no one funds. The ones they forget. Victor felt the words hit like hammers. How many years had he sat at charity galas raising funds for children's hospitals, never realizing how much of that money looped back into the pockets of polished executives instead of the patients themselves? I'll fund it your way, Victor said at last. Not for glory. Not for shareholders. Not to make myself feel better. Just because it's right. Amir didn't thank him. He didn't need to. That night, Victor didn't sleep much. Not because of guilt, but because for the first time in years, he felt awake. The backlash came faster than Victor expected. By the next morning, headlines had shifted. The media loved heroes, but they loved villains even more. Billionaire blocks medical breakthrough over control issues, one headline screamed. Others suggested that Amir was being manipulated by Victor, twisted into rejecting help from established institutions out of some misplaced loyalty. Social media turned into a war zone. Half the world praised Amir's brilliance. The other half accused Victor of exploiting a child prodigy for personal gain. The same reporters who smiled during interviews now sharpened their words, calling Victor everything from controlling to outdated to part of the old system holding back progress. What none of them knew was that Amir was the one calling the shots. Victor had spent his life in boardrooms, negotiating hostile takeovers and billion-dollar deals. He'd never felt outmaneuvered until now, not by lawyers, but by a 15-year-old who'd spent more time fixing broken toys on street corners than inside classrooms. Amir wasn't playing chess with them. He was building an entirely new game. Emily didn't know any of this. Her entire world had shrunk to the soft clicks and hums of the device strapped to her legs, Amir's gentle voice coaching her through the pain. She smiled more now, a rare, fierce thing that made the whole house feel different. Every small step was a rebellion against the prognosis that had chained her to that chair. But the outside world wanted blood, and the corporate offers came with fangs hidden behind velvet. A senator made a speech in Congress about protecting innovation for the common good, implying that Victor's interference was robbing millions of disabled children of a chance at mobility. Pharmaceutical lobbyists hinted that Amir's design was unregulated and unsafe, urging the government to seize the prototype for proper testing. Victor could feel it happening, the same way he'd watched governments buckle before wealth and influence his whole career. But this time, he wasn't on the winning side, not because of lack of power, but because they had the perfect weapon, public outrage. Then came the worst moment yet, an invitation to a live televised interview. Not for Victor. For Amir. A famous talk show host, known for his human interest pieces, offered to tell Amir's story to the world properly. The words reeked of exploitation. Victor wanted to smash the television when he heard the invitation. But Amir said yes. Victor tried to stop him. They'll twist your words. They don't want the truth. They want the version that sells. Amir just shook his head. Let them. I'm not afraid of what I have to say. The studio was polished, artificial, lights too bright, everything staged for maximum emotional pull. But Amir sat in that chair like a soldier walking into a battlefield, knowing the odds, and not caring. When the interviewer asked about his resistance to selling his invention to companies that could help millions, Amir spoke clearly, no hesitation. "Why is it," he said, "that helping millions always seems to make someone else rich first? Why does help only come with a price tag?" The interviewer smiled nervously, trying to steer the narrative. "But surely some compromise." Amir interrupted. "The compromise is that I'm even here. I didn't build this for fame. I built it for her." And then, because the world loves symbols more than statistics, Amir pulled out a worn photograph of Emily, smiling before the accident, healthy, running across the garden behind their home. "This is who I built it for. You want to help millions? Start by helping one." The internet exploded within minutes. Clips of Amir's defiant speech flooded social platforms, remixed, subtitled, translated into dozens of languages. The corporations trying to buy his work suddenly looked like wolves circling a lamb. But Amir wasn't a lamb. He was a wolf in disguise, and now the world knew it. Victor didn't get involved. He didn't need to. Amir was reshaping the battlefield by simply refusing to play by their rules. Not because he was naive, but because he was honest, and honesty terrified systems built on carefully curated lies. That night, the hate turned into admiration. Influencers who had mocked Amir before now posted supportive videos. Disabled activists spoke up, calling the boy a hero for putting real people before profit. Even celebrities started using Amir's photo as their profile pictures, a new kind of social rebellion against the corporate machine. But what mattered most wasn't the likes or the follows. It was the flood of messages pouring into Victor's private channels. Families with paralyzed children, desperate for hope, offering their life savings for a chance at Amir's device. Victor read them all. Some were simple: "Please help my son walk again." Others were painful confessions: "We mortgaged our home trying everything. We have nothing left but hope." Victor didn't feel powerful reading those messages. He felt responsible. He gathered his legal team again, this time with one clear instruction: build a foundation. Not a corporation. Not a brand. A non-profit, dedicated solely to replicating Amir's design at scale, distributing it free of charge to families who needed it most. And Amir would be its first director, not as a figurehead, but as the true architect of its mission. Victor also knew they'd need protection. Patents, copyrights, legal structures to prevent corporate raiders from swooping in under a different flag. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. When he told Amir, the boy didn't smile. He simply nodded once. "Good. But don't put my name on it. I don't want statues or speeches. Just get them what they need." Victor had spent his life building empires. He'd never realized until that moment that empires crumbled, but legacies didn't. The final piece of the puzzle came from someone unexpected: Emily. One night, while the adults talked business, Emily rolled her chair to Amir's workbench. "I want to help," she said quietly. "Not just with walking. With building." Amir glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "You." "I'm not broken," she said softly. "Just learning differently now." It was a declaration of war against the pity the world kept throwing at her. Victor watched from the doorway, realizing something profound. His daughter didn't need rescuing. She needed purpose, and she'd just found it. That was the start, not the finish. Not a happy ending, neatly tied with applause and headlines. Just the start of something bigger. Something no amount of money could buy or destroy. And this time, Victor wasn't leading it. He was following. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Major outlets, influencers, advocacy groups, and parents of disabled children began amplifying Amir's story beyond anything Victor could have orchestrated. But with the spotlight came the shadow. Powerful medical device corporations saw what was happening, and their shareholders didn't like it. Private emails leaked, Emails showing CEOs labeling Amir a threat to intellectual property norms, urging policymakers to tighten restrictions on independent medical inventions. They couldn't sue a kid on live TV without public outrage, but they could start whisper campaigns, lobbying efforts, and regulatory obstacles. The war wasn't on the surface anymore. It was hidden, quiet, strategic. Victor, for all his wealth and connections, realized he was fighting a system he helped build. The system didn't mind helping people. It minded helping them without making someone rich first. This wasn't about technology. It was about control, about who got to decide who deserved help and who didn't. That realization burned in Victor's stomach like acid. All the deals, the mergers, the partnerships he'd taken pride in suddenly looked like bricks in a prison he didn't know he was building. Meanwhile, Amir didn't stop working. The prototype that helped Emily take her first step wasn't enough for him. He worked nights modifying designs, reading case studies from university journals online, watching obscure lectures on biomechanics, and learning software programming so he could customize every single movement calibration based on the person's injury. It was obsession, but not for glory. It was the obsession of someone who refused to let good enough be the last chapter of someone's story. The turning point came with a letter. Not an email. A letter. Written on paper, folded neatly in an envelope, addressed to Amir in shaky handwriting. It was from a mother in a rural village halfway across the world. Her daughter, born with cerebral palsy, had spent her whole life in a chair. No one in her town could afford anything like the experimental treatments the rich talked about on television. But somehow they had seen Amir's interview, shared from neighbor to neighbor, copied to old smartphones. The letter didn't beg for help. It didn't plead for charity. It simply said, "We see you. We believe in what you're doing. Even if we never get one of those machines, thank you for reminding us we aren't forgotten." That single letter hit harder than any award, headline, or check Amir could have received. It changed Victor too. For decades, Victor measured success in zeros on a spreadsheet. Now, success had a face. A mother in a forgotten village, still standing in dignity despite everything against her. It reminded him that some people don't want charity, they want fairness. They don't want to be rescued, they want to be remembered. Victor doubled the legal team. This time, not to fight corporations with press releases but with airtight intellectual property protections. They filed for defensive patents, not to stop others from using the designs, but to prevent corporations from patenting around Amir's work, effectively trapping the technology behind expensive licenses. Everything was structured through the non-profit they'd launched, built with transparency clauses, public reporting, and community oversight. Every decision had to answer one question: does this help the people who need it the most? But legal defenses wouldn't be enough. They needed allies. That's when the letters started turning into volunteers. Engineers from small startups emailed, asking if they could help. Physical therapists from clinics in impoverished neighborhoods volunteered to test prototype. Coders wrote open-source software for the devices to be tailored to each patient's unique condition. Disabled activists provided direct input on how to design the interfaces so that they were intuitive for people with limited dexterity. The movement stopped being about Amir or Victor. It became a global rebellion against systems that made access to healing a privilege instead of a right. Victor's old partners tried to call him. They offered buyouts, partnerships, mergers, anything to get a piece of what was growing. But Victor ignored them all. For the first time in his life, the pursuit of more wasn't tempting. More wealth, more control, more accolades, it all felt like shadows now. What mattered were results. One child standing for the first time, one family crying over a video of their son taking a step after a decade in a chair. Emily was changing too. Her first steps were wobbly, painful, uneven. But with each adjustment Amir made to the suit, she improved. More importantly, she wanted to improve. No one was pushing her anymore. The world had shifted from "will she walk again?" to "watch her go." One day, while Emily practiced, she looked at Victor and said something that would stay with him forever. "Don't be proud because of what I'm doing. Be proud because you stopped pretending I couldn't." It wasn't forgiveness. It was truth. Brutal. Necessary. Healing. Victor's past mistakes weren't erased by good intentions or new projects. The damage done by years of inaction didn't disappear because of one noble effort. But growth didn't require perfection, it required responsibility. And finally, Victor was carrying his weight. The nonprofit's website wasn't flashy. No celebrity endorsements, no luxury launch parties. Just a single headline: "Building tools so children can walk freely." Beneath it, downloadable plans for the latest prototype, written instructions in over 20 languages, and a contact form for anyone who wanted to help or needed help. Everything open. Everything transparent. The corporations trying to corner the market couldn't stop an idea that refused to be sold. Victor wasn't at the center of it anymore. Neither was Amir. It belonged to the people who needed it most. But that didn't mean the fight was over. Every day brought new challenges. Policy obstacles, counterattacks by lobbyists, smear campaigns labeling their designs dangerous or unproven. Yet every day also brought victories. Small, quiet, powerful. A video of a girl in Brazil taking her first assisted step. A school in Nigeria printing parts for a local child's device using a 3D printer donated by a retired engineer. Volunteers from unlikely places, former pharmaceutical executives, now ashamed of their past work, donating their time and expertise to ensure safety standards were met without exploiting patients. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. But it was unstoppable. And through all of it, Amir kept going. Not because he wanted fame, but because, as he said one night to Emily, "If you know how to build a bridge and someone's drowning, you don't wait for someone to pay you. You build." Victor finally understood the lesson Amir had been teaching all along. Not just about technology, but about life. It's not the mistakes that define us. It's what we build after them that counts. The fight for this invention's survival took a new form, sharper than legal documents or media storms. It became a matter of cultural perception. For decades, society had been conditioned to believe that innovation came from universities, white coats, corporate boardrooms, and elite scientists with long, complicated resumes. The idea that a barefoot orphan on the streets could create life-changing technology was not just unbelievable, it was uncomfortable. The powerful feared what it represented: the dismantling of traditional hierarchies of intelligence, success, and influence. Amir's work wasn't just about mobility, it was about rewriting the rules of who mattered in the world of invention. This discomfort didn't just come from corporations. Even well-meaning people began saying things like, "It's amazing for someone like him," or "What a heartwarming story of a poor boy's lucky break." They couldn't yet accept that this wasn't luck, it was brilliance combined with discipline. Amir didn't stumble across a solution, he created it. And that made certain people nervous. Victor saw it clearly now. For most of his life, he'd sat in conferences about innovation, surrounded by people who all looked like him, talked like him, and played golf at the same expensive resort. Now, he saw that genius had never belonged to wealth. Wealth only decided who got handed the microphone. The tension escalated during a global innovation conference, where Victor and Amir were invited to present. Journalists crowded the entrance, eager to capture the story of the beggar boy and the billionaire, as they liked to call it. But Amir refused that narrative. "Don't call me a beggar," he said quietly before going on stage. "I've never begged. I've built." His words hit harder than any PR campaign could have. In that packed auditorium, Amir stood there, not in designer clothes, not with rehearsed talking points, just raw honesty. And when he explained, in simple but eloquent words, how he taught himself mechanical principles from library books, watched outdated medical lectures on public channels, and spent months scavenging for discarded electronics to build early prototypes, the room went silent. not with pity, with respect. But not everyone was convinced. The discomfort of the elite wasn't just about losing credit, it was about losing control. A coalition of powerful executives from the prosthetics and rehabilitation industry began a coordinated lobbying effort, targeting governments with claims that Amir's designs posed untested risks to patients. Their aim wasn't safety, it was sabotage. They proposed legislation requiring costly certification processes that small inventors could never afford, effectively gatekeeping medical innovation to only those corporations with multi-million-dollar legal teams. Victor used to be one of those executives. Now, he stood firmly on the other side of that wall, determined to tear it down brick by brick. It was Amir who provided the breakthrough idea, not technological, but strategic. "They want us to play by their rules," he said one night while reviewing design modifications. "What if we don't need their game at all? What if we make our own?" That's when the concept of decentralized fabrication was born. Instead of relying on one central organization to manufacture the devices, Amir proposed releasing modular, adaptable designs to be produced by local communities using affordable 3D printers and open-source microcontrollers. Every kit could be adapted by local engineers and therapists to fit cultural and physical need. No single authority could control it. It wasn't just a project now, it was a movement. Victor called in favors. Not from CEOs but from old college friends working in the nonprofit tech sector. They partnered with grassroots organizations worldwide. Soon, small workshops appeared in garages, schools, and community centers from Mumbai to Detroit, from Johannesburg to Lima. People who had never spoken to each other were now exchanging blueprints, code, and techniques through online forums built specifically for this cause. The elite didn't know how to stop it. You can sue a company. You can shut down a website. But you can't outlaw an idea that lives simultaneously on thousands of hard drives and in millions of hearts. And then something extraordinary happened. Those same communities began improving Amir's designs. They made parts sturdier with local materials. They modified straps to accommodate regional clothing styles. One workshop in Eastern Europe discovered a new joint stabilization technique that increased endurance by 40%. Innovation, true innovation, was no longer gated behind exclusive conferences or million-dollar labs. It was happening in real time, across cultures, languages, and borders. Victor had spent decades believing leadership meant control. Now he realized it meant service. Through all of this, Emily's recovery continued. With each passing week, she grew stronger, not just physically, but mentally. She wasn't afraid to fall anymore. She laughed when she stumbled, and cheered when she succeeded. More importantly, she took on a new role, teacher. Using the video calls set up by the nonprofit, Emily began teaching younger children around the world how to balance, how to trust the machines, how to stand tall even when their legs felt like rubber. Emily wasn't just learning to walk, she was leading others to stand. Amir, for his part, never accepted money. He accepted tools, software. But no one could write him a check large enough to buy what he valued, dignity. "They can keep their money," he said to Victor once. "Let them see what happens when people who've been ignored stop waiting for permission." Victor finally understood why wealth without purpose felt empty. He no longer measured his life by the size of his house or the value of his investment. His success was in the faces of children he would never meet but who would take their first steps because two worlds, one of privilege and one of poverty, finally met not in charity but in partnership. Governments tried to get involved, some to help, others to regulate. But by that point, the decentralization had worked too well. The movement had grown too large, too distributed, too nimble for any single authority to claim control. And that was exactly how Amir wanted it. It wasn't just about walking anymore. It was about standing up, in every sense of the word. As Victor sat alone one night, watching another video of a child halfway across the world rise shakily from a wheelchair, he realized something profound. Redemption isn't something you beg for. It's something you build, brick, by returning what you took, by amplifying voices you once ignored, and by stepping back when others are ready to lead. The old world was crumbling, and from its rubble, a better one was walking forward. Months later, something remarkable happened. What had started as a desperate promise by a ragged boy in the streets had blossomed into a global shift in how society valued ideas, innovation, and people. It wasn't just about helping a millionaire's daughter walk again anymore. It was about breaking the unspoken chains that had held creativity hostage behind wealth, titles, and polished resumes. Around the world, headlines no longer focused solely on Amir's story but on a larger movement, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not waiting for permission, and not caring about traditional gatekeepers. In neighborhoods once ignored by politicians and abandoned by wealthy investors, workshops buzzed with purpose. Community leaders who had spent years begging for grants now worked alongside engineers, students, and grandmothers learning CAD software late into the night. They weren't building for charity. They were building for themselves, their neighbors, and their futures. What started as a project to help children walk became something greater. People began adapting the designs for adults, athletes recovering from injuries, soldiers returning home from wars missing limbs, elderly people needing support to maintain their independence. The reach extended beyond borders, beyond class, beyond everything that had once divided them. What was most striking was the cultural shift happening within the very circles that had initially tried to stop Amir. Slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably, major corporations began publicly supporting the initiative, not because they believed in it, but because they couldn't afford the bad publicity of opposing it. But in boardrooms, some executives quietly admitted to each other that they'd been beaten, not by competition, but by cooperation. A few companies tried to rebrand Amir's work under their logos, but the decentralized community was too vigilant, too proud of its roots, to let that theft succeed. Victor became a strange figure in this new world. Once a symbol of elite detachment, he was now respected for his advocacy, not for his fortune. He became a mentor, not to teach, but to listen, to elevate voices that had gone unheard for too long. And Victor learned humility the hard way, not through defeat but through contribution. The more he gave without expecting recognition, the more fulfilled he became. It was the opposite of everything he'd been taught in business school. But perhaps the most important transformation happened within Amir himself. For years, he had defined himself by what he lacked: a home, parents, formal schooling, a place in society. Now, those things no longer weighed on him. He wasn't trying to prove himself to the world anymore. He was the proof, and he carried that realization not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. When interviewed by a major international outlet, the journalist asked him, "How does it feel to finally have everything you deserve?" Amir smiled softly and answered, "I've always had it. You're just noticing now." Meanwhile, Emily became a beacon of resilience and leadership. She didn't want to be remembered as the rich girl who got helped by a poor boy. She wanted to be known as the girl who stood up and then helped others stand. Using her father's connections, she started organizing local events for disabled children, partnering with the very workshops that had once worked late into the night to assemble her own device. But this time, it wasn't just about rehabilitation. It was about inclusion, visibility, and pride. Emily insisted on one thing during these events: that Amir's name and story be front and center, not because he wanted fame, but because young inventors needed to see that intelligence had no uniform, no address, no exclusive language. It was as common as hunger, as necessary as air, and as unstoppable as hope. Slowly but surely, the language around Amir's invention began to change. No longer referred to as the beggar boy's miracle, it was now widely known as the People's Framework, a fitting title for something that belonged to everyone, not to patent holders or shareholders. Governments around the world, still scrambling to catch up, began integrating the People's Framework into national healthcare policies. Schools added basic engineering and design thinking into their curricula, inspired by Amir's story. Grants and scholarships were established for young inventors from disadvantaged backgrounds. A global mentorship program paired retired engineers with street kids, not as charity but as equals. Mentorship wasn't about giving, it was about sharing, about learning together, and about creating spaces where brilliance could emerge, regardless of origin. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Amir, standing on a simple stage in a community center, not a gala, not a red carpet event, addressed a group of teenagers who had once been just like him. Underestimated, overlooked, underestimated again. His message was clear. They said I wasn't supposed to build anything. They said people like me are supposed to ask for help, not give it. But I'm not special, I'm just stubborn. And stubbornness isn't a curse. It's a gift if you know how to use it. There were no fireworks, no confetti, no dramatic applause. Just silence, the good kind. The kind that follows truth when it lands too heavy to ignore. And then, like ripples spreading from a single drop, those kids went out into the world and began building their own futures, one stubborn act at a time. Amir knew he wouldn't see half of what they would accomplish, but that was the point. Leadership, he had learned, wasn't about standing in front forever. It was about stepping aside when others were ready to move forward on their own. Victor, once consumed by legacy in the form of buildings, bank accounts, and biographies, realized that legacy wasn't about what people remembered about you, it was about what they could do because of you. His wealth no longer defined him. His willingness to serve did. Emily, standing taller than anyone thought possible, embodied that lesson fully. She never again let people define her by her condition. She defined herself by her choices, by standing when she could have sat, by leading when she could have followed, by amplifying others when she could have simply enjoyed her personal victory. The people's framework changed lives. But the real invention wasn't mechanical. It was social, cultural, human. It dismantled prejudice. It replaced pity with partnership. It transformed quiet endurance into loud leadership. And it didn't belong to any one person. It belonged to everyone who refused to wait for permission to matter. And that was the real miracle.